Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my privilege to serve as the president of the Board of Trustees of the Lawson Center, and it's my privilege to welcome you tonight to the third of our 5 lecture series for this season. Ned Ward, one of our illustrious historians in the area, is going to treat us tonight to a lecture about timbering around the Chautauqua watershed in the good old days. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ned. Please welcome our speaker.
I want to thank our sponsors tonight, EBC for the beer, Bag and String down in Lakewood for the wine, and the golf club down here at Bemis for the hors d'oeuvres. Just to say thank you for your sponsorship of the programming at the Lawson Center. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the watershed and the original settlers here. We have to go back to the Holland Land Company to see why this area was timbered and why it was settled. You see there a map, it's called the Burr map, of the Holland Land Company purchase. They purchased about 2.5 million acres of land for about $1 million, which included most of western New York. When they did that, there was one little problem. The Native Americans had rights to it, and they were called preempted rights. Bill, correct me if I'm wrong back there. I have legal counsel here. But they sought to resolve those rights through the Treaty of Big Tree, which they did, and the terms weren't especially good for the Native Americans. They got $100,000 in cash and 6 cows and personal annuities for all the chiefs that attended that conference. So they were poorly served at best. The land was surveyed by Joseph Ellicott, and he had a crew of 130 people. They went about the task of clearing straight sight lines so that they could break that 2.5 million acres of land into smaller plots that were saleable. And the Holland Land Company was a syndicate of about 15 Holland bankers who were promoters and wanted to make money on the opportunity they had here. So their idea was to break it into small plots and then sell it off. Their property sales began in 1801, and it didn't take long, but what people were progressing from the areas down around Albany and Schenectady and the areas that had really essentially been timbered by that time to come out here and seek to farm and timber. There were 2 groups. There were the wealthier of the people who settled here, and there's some of them listed here that are well known in our area that bought major acreage for about $2 an acre. And then there were the other people that the land was a little rich for their blood. They could only buy a few acres, probably 20 to 100 acres at best. And they didn't have the money to do that, so they would pay a down payment at the Holland Land Company sub-office up in Mayville, and you can still see the sub-office vault if you go up by the county courthouse. So they bought essentially a mortgage, which they called at that time an article on the land, with the promise to pay the balance over time. For most, it was 10 years or more. And it wasn't an easy thing because there was no real easy way to make money. Ellicott did his best to try and sell the land. He was made residence, land officer in residence for the Holland Land Company. And he helped them to lower rates, interest rates, and extend terms. He helped them to build roads and use the labor as in-kind payments. And he also lent money for the construction of sawmills, knowing that sawmills usually were a nucleus for the start of a city. What they found when they got here was a mix of forest, very heavily forested area, and you can see the various percentages of trees that they found here. And the reason we know this is that when Ellicott was surveying, his surveyors not only took their chains, but they took notebooks. And when they found a tree that was a border tree on a township or range, they would mark it and then make notes of the species of tree that was on that corner. And those trees stood throughout a long period of time because everyone knew, including later the loggers, that they were important to designate the land boundaries. But you can see white pine is highlighted there, and there's a number of reasons for that. White pine was a very light wood. By comparison of density, it was one of the lightest woods in our forests, which meant it floated. It was also one of the softest. The Janka scale is a measure of hardness of wood. The white pine was very soft by comparison, which meant it was very, very workable. You could easily cut it with an axe, you could shape it with chisels and gouges, split it for shingles, things like that. So they primarily sought out the very large, and they were very large, white pine to market for use, first for use to build homes and things for themselves, but then later to market. This was the size of some of the trees. This picture was actually taken around the turn of the 20th century. It was a remnant pine that was still standing down, I believe, down between Carroll and Warren. And this one in particular was 381 years old and yielded about 6,000 board feet of lumber. Used that lumber, was used for building homes, heating and cooking, manufactures of certain chemicals, millwork, staves, things. Well, this would have been a typical pioneer's home that you would see in Chautauqua County. Say he had taken out a 20-acre article, he would clear a certain percentage of that simply to provide the logs to build a log cabin. And the logs would be saddled on the ends. You can see right here, they're a U-shaped saddle so that one log fits into the other and holds it tight. Typically, they wouldn't have a window. They would have a door. The first doors were simply skins hung from the opening, and then they got so that they could split or rive lumber into flat pieces and use it to make a door. If they had a window, windows were made not from glass. Glass, you'd have to go clear down to Pittsburgh to get a piece of glass. So the pioneers here would take pieces of paper, soak them in lard, and that lard would make the paper transparent. And then they would have a means of getting some light into the cabin. Floors were typically just split chestnut. You can see he's using an axe. Saws hadn't come around yet. And you can see there isn't much of a clearing there. He's only got enough cleared up for his home. The stumps are still in evidence, and the plan would be that once he got a cabin erected, he would then go on to girdle or cut a ring around the other trees sufficient to kill them so that sunlight could penetrate and they could plant crops between the stumps. The homes weren't insulated. They were, again, made of logs, and they would, what they call, chink them between the logs using a mix of mud and moss or another organic product stuffed in between the gaps to make them a little less windproof. They cooked on hearths, and the chimneys weren't especially efficient, so the use of wood for cooking and heating was fairly substantial, but still at this time there was only around 2,000 people in the whole of Chautauqua County. So their actions didn't have much of a consequence to the environment. They then began to pull the stumps, and this is a copy of a patent on a fairly early stump that allowed farmers to pull 40 to 60 stumps a day. There are a number of different styles of these. Some were tripods with a jack screw, and they attach the chain to the stump, and then the oxen would turn that tripod around. It was on wheels, and pull the stumps out. On the right, you can see that is Tom's Point, or what was then called White's Point, and that is a stump fence. Farmers would use the fence, the stumps that they had pulled out, roll them into a fence, and use them to hold their livestock. I can remember as a youth, there was still a stump fence on the Shepherdson farm, which is over, just over by the Methodist church. It was hard to make a living. It was extremely hard. And you can get a sense of that by a passage in Bugby's biographical and historical sketches of the early settlers. If you ever go to South Stockton, there's a big home on your left that I believe was Abel Brunson's home. And it says here, Mr. Brunson used to relate that for a number of years after he began work on the farm, he plied with his axe, and with such unremitting stroke that he knew nothing of Sundays or hardly the day of the month. As often as he obtained $5, he would go on foot to the land office and make a payment. And South Stockton to Mayville and back was 22 miles. On the 10th of February, 1831, he made his last payment and received his deed from the hands of William Peacock. To accomplish this, he had labored 20 years when the original debt was but $300 of the present day, but Mr. Brunson was 1 in 100 among the first settlers who were able to pay for their land. So, what did they do? They had crops, meager crops at best. They turned to cutting the hardwoods on their acreage and making potash. And the way they did that, they would cut the hardwood log, cut them into lengths, and then on an appointed day, they would call in all of their neighbors, and they would haul those logs to a common area and burn them, and then carefully collect the ash afterwards. So, a couple of passages here, one from Gilbert Hazeltine. It says, for the first quarter of the century of the settlement of the county, the fires were constantly burning in the fallen timber. The light of their flames nightly illuminated the sky. From the hilltops along the ridge could be seen in all directions between Lake Erie and Pennsylvania line, great volumes of smoke constantly ascending into the clouds. So to give an idea of how important this was to the people, I found a diary that was written in 1824, and it talked about the hardships in the area. It starts out March 25th. My husband Varnum went hunting today and brought home a deer. We've had no meat but venison and a few partridges since October. A bear carried away our hog in November, and the foxes caught all the chicken. April 6th, sold 3 bushels of wheat today for 3 shillings and 9 pence a bushel. The first money we have had since January, when Isaac sold 2 fox skins, 11 mink skins, and 2 quarters of venison for $6. August 1, Isaac has got ready for the logging. We brewed root beer. August 6th, had a logging bee today. There were 8 yokes of oxen here. Some of them came 5 miles. Royal Putnam and John Robinson took charge of the bee. Our root beer is first class. I'm not sure I agree with the next part. The men prefer it to whiskey. September 2nd, set the logging on fire. The 8th, had a good burn. Commenced today to gather the ashes. We're very choice of the ashes. Everything must be put aside until we can get them to the ashery. So that's what they were up against. They did the best they could. This would be the leaching process here. They had gathered up the ashes, they put it in a vat, and then pour water through it to extract the leachate. The leachate was then boiled down in something like this. I think 4 of these big pots, and they're pretty big. There's one on the Ellery Fredonia Road on the left at Mr. Swan's house, one over on the Asheville Hill as you're going up by the marinas, and one down here at Greenhurst just past the town park. You still see them now and then. They're very thick because they would take that ash leachate and put it in there and evaporate it. And the amount of evaporation they did determined whether it became one product or another. One product being potash, the other being black salts. And black salts were kind of a thick, gooey black mess that was kind of concentrating the salts so that they would bring a higher price and could be transported easier. At the ashery, typically they'd have a big oven. You'd bring your ashes or your potash, and they would actually bake it down red hot until it baked it to kind of a grayish color, and it had a pearly look to it, so they called it pearl ash. And this is what merchants were looking for because it was easily transported and brought a very good price. It was used for a substitute for baking powder. It was also used in the making of glass. So a lot of it went to Pittsburgh or up to Montreal. Asheville, down there were 4 asheries. That shows you a little bit of the importance and the amount of trade that was being done by these farmers trying to keep themselves from going bankrupt. They were the only crop that could be sold and used to pay your taxes or for your indebtedness on your land. Most places, not saying anything ill about Asheville, but most places would pay low and charge you high for whatever you bartered for, which is typical of the day. Population began rising. It was extremely important that they keep producing pearl ash, so more and more people were coming in. When we had 2,381 people, it wasn't much of a problem, but now you've got 34,000 people in the county and poor soils, so they tended to rely on making potash and selling it for a good share of their living. So the woods was getting literally decimated. Took 10 acres of hardwood ash to yield 1 ton of potash. And a gentleman by the name of Walter Smith sold in 1 year 500 tons. So if you do the math, that was 5,000 acres of hardwoods eliminated from our county in 1 year, and that business went on for many, many years. Well, the other chemical industry that the woods supplied was tannin, and it was made from hemlock bark. The bark yielded a tannin percentage of about 10 to 20%. It was used to tan leather. At first, it was easier to bring the hides to the place where they were being tanned. So you had tanneries spring up in Jamestown. Saws hadn't really become prevalent yet, but they would actually cut a ring or girdle this tree in 4-foot heights down near the bottom, and then cut it down so they didn't ruin that first bit of bark. And then once it was on the ground, they girdle every 4 feet and strip the bark off. Log rafts were taken from Chautauqua Lake down through the outlet to Warren, PA, and then on down as far as New Orleans. And these were substantial rafts of logs. They were 16 by 16. And there were at one time enough people in the logging business that the county legislature changed the date of voting in 1851 so that people who had logged in the spring and taken these rafts south would have enough time to get back up north and participate.
How'd they get that?
We're going to get to that, Dan. This is a typical crew getting up in the morning. I call them dog houses they slept in. When they got further south on the big rivers, they'd have a cabin where the crew slept and the cook cooked. But this was pretty